Dear viewers, 80 years ago, a devastating famine swept across northern Vietnam, claiming the lives of over 2 million people. It was a catastrophe that left behind unimaginable suffering, etching sorrow into the very soul of the nation. Even after 8 decades, the harrowing memories of the Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 remain deeply ingrained in the hearts of the Vietnamese people. When we speak of this tragic event, most recall it as the Famine of 1945, often referring to it as the Dao famine, after the lunar year in which it peaked. However, historical records reveal that this catastrophe began much earlier, around March 1944, reaching its most devastating phase between July and August of that year. The famine raged on through the first half of 1945, only coming to an end when Vietnam's revolutionary movement, led by the Communist Party of Vietnam and President Ho Chi Minh, rose to its peak, culminating in the victorious August Revolution of 1945. To grasp the scale of this tragedy, President Ho Chi Minh himself once compared the famine's toll to that of World War II in Europe. In 6 years of war, France lost 1 million lives, and Germany around 3 million. Yet, in just 6 months, over 2 million people perished in northern Vietnam due to starvation, an unfathomable toll. The Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 was not merely a consequence of natural disaster but a man-made catastrophe, driven by the exploitative policies of the Japanese and French colonial forces. The Vietnamese Communist Party's Chronological History, Volume 2, published by the National Political Publishing House in 2008, records on page 921. Due to the brutal plundering of resources by the Japanese and French fascists, coupled with Allied bombing raids that disrupted transportation between the North and South, as well as severe crop failures from late 1944 to early 1945, a devastating famine struck northern and north-central Vietnam. The Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 remains the most catastrophic famine in Vietnamese history. In just a short period, it claimed the lives of 2 million people, nearly 1/10 of the country's population at the time. Entire villages were wiped out. Provinces such as Nam Dinh, Tay Ben, and Ninh Ben suffered unimaginable losses. The seeds of this disaster were sown long before the famine peaked. In October 1940, as soon as Japan set foot in French Indochina, they immediately imposed a series of ruthless economic policies. The Japanese military government forced the French colonial authorities to sign treaties that compelled Vietnam to supply large quantities of rice annually, serving Japan's war efforts. Banned the transportation of rice from southern to northern Vietnam, effectively cutting off vital food supplies. Restricted private food transport, allowing only 50 kilograms of rice per person within a single province. Ordered farmers to uproot rice crops and replace them with industrial plants like jute and peanuts, prioritizing war needs over human survival. As Japan drained Vietnam's resources for its military ambitions, the French colonial regime also hoarded food supplies, preparing for the possibility of war with Japan or a return to power in Vietnam. Caught in the crossfire of two oppressive regimes, the Vietnamese farmers suffered the most. They were burdened by crushing taxes, including the infamous head tax and land rent tax, which left them even more vulnerable. The year 1944 was particularly cruel. Vietnam faced widespread crop failures, yet the French colonial government and puppet rulers still forcibly delivered over 900,000 tons of rice to Japan to support its fascist war machine. Some of this rice wasn't even used as food, it was converted into alcohol production and used as fuel in place of coal. The consequences were devastating. Thousands of hectares of cornfields were destroyed, and millions of tons of rice were confiscated. Between 1940 and 1944, jute production skyrocketed from 5,000 hectares to 45,000 hectares, displacing food crops and worsening the crisis. Meanwhile, the Japanese authorities continued their merciless rice collection across northern Vietnam, sending prices soaring to unimaginable levels. 1943, official price of 31 dong per 100 kilograms of rice, black market price 57 dong. 1944, official price rose to 40 dong, black market price surged to 350 dong. 1945, the black market price doubled to 700 to 800 dong per 100 kilograms, while the official price remained at 53 dong. For the poor, rice became an unattainable luxury. Millions were pushed to the brink of starvation. And then came nature's final blow. In September 1944, a catastrophic flood struck central Vietnam, breaking the La Giang Dike in Ha Tin and flooding Nam. The destruction of farmland further intensified the famine. With no food, no aid, and no escape, starvation spread like wildfire. In the province of Tien Hai, Tai Ben, the famine was especially cruel. The entire 1944 harvest was lost as crops withered and died. Hundreds of hectares of farmland yielded almost nothing, with some fields barely producing a few kilograms of edible rice. The famine swept through 32 provinces in northern and north-central Vietnam, stretching from Quang Tri to the northernmost regions. The most devastated areas were densely populated rice-farming provinces like Tai Ben, Nam Dinh, Hai Phong, and Tan Hoa. No one was spared, rich or poor, young or old. But the ones who suffered the most were the landless peasants, the farmers who survived by renting land, the laborers who worked on others' fields. They had no food reserves. They had no way out. Desperate to stay alive, people turned to anything that could be swallowed. Wild vegetables, banana stems, and tree bark. Dead livestock, cows, buffaloes, even dogs and cats. Rotten fish and sea roots dug up from the shore. And when there was nothing left to eat, they waited for death. Some died in their homes, waiting to be buried by their families. Others collapsed by the roadside, too weak to continue searching for food. Entire families perished together, leaving houses abandoned, villages emptied. By March 1945, the famine reached its deadliest peak. Thousands of starving peasants fled their villages, heading to the big cities in desperate search of food. They sold whatever they had left, their homes, their land, their last possessions, just to buy passage. In Hanoi, something extraordinary happened. Ordinary citizens united. They organized food relief efforts, setting up soup kitchens and distributing free rice porridge to the dying. At Bat Jayap camp, the barely alive were taken in and given whatever help was possible. But for many, it was too late. The streets of Hanoi became filled with the dead, bodies lying where they had fallen. Every day, carts piled high with corpses were wheeled to Hop Tien Cemetery in Hai Ba Trung, where they were dumped into mass graves. The Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 was more than just starvation. It destroyed families, turned loved ones against each other, and shattered communities. It was a tragedy that left scars on an entire nation, a disaster created by war, oppression, and merciless policies. Pastor Le Van Thai, who served as president of the Evangelical Church of Vietnam from 1942 to 1960, wrote about the horrors he witnessed. I often heard the whispers of those on the brink of death. I saw piles of convulsing flesh beside lifeless bodies, 5 or 6 corpses in one place, heaps of the living tangled among the dead elsewhere. Bullock carts overflowing with corpses, each cart covered only by a thin mat. In mass graves, hundreds of bodies were buried at a time. The famine-stricken fought over scraps of rotting vegetables from garbage piles, or a few grains of rice spilled near a cooking pot. When wastewater from washing rice was thrown out, crowds rushed forward, desperate to scoop up what little they could. Entire processions of the starving formed, men, women, children, the elderly, marching endlessly, their bony bodies trembling under rags crawling with lice. Even young girls, who once would have been shy and modest, lost all sense of shame, reduced to skeletal, trembling figures. At times, they stopped to close the eyes of a fallen companion, someone who collapsed mid-journey and would never rise again. Others stripped the dead of their last rags, because even the dignity of burial was a privilege they could no longer afford. In April 1945, Italian journalist Vespa reported on the desperate uprising against hunger. On March 9, 1945, when Japan overthrew the French colonial administration, the Viet Minh seized the moment. They rallied the people to storm Japanese rice warehouses, breaking open hundreds of storage facilities to distribute food to the starving masses. This defiant rebellion sparked a wave of hope. Farmers, once broken by famine, slowly returned to their villages, determined to plow their fields once more. By June 1945, the first post-famine rice harvest arrived. But for many, salvation came too late. The sudden return of food led to deadly consequences. Many, too weakened by starvation, died of overeating. Meanwhile, the land itself had turned into a death trap. Rotting bodies polluted the water. Mass graves overflowed, left unburied for weeks. Diseases like cholera and yellow fever swept through entire villages. Entire communities vanished. Some villages lost 50% to 80% of their population. In Tai Ben alone, 280,000 people perished, 1/4 of the entire province. In Ha Son Ben, 80,000 people succumbed to famine, 10% of the region's total population. The horrific statistics continued. Pushpin Nam Din, 212,218 deaths. Pushpin Ninh Ben, 37,939 deaths. Pushpin Ha Nam, 50,398 deaths. In Nia Hung, Nam Din, 400 people died every single day. In Kim Sun, Ninh Ben, 22,908 people perished. Across Hanam Ninh province, 1,571 families were completely wiped out, not a single survivor remained. By the end of 1945, entire villages lay in ruins. Handicraft industries collapsed, as those who once practiced the trades were gone. The famine had not only starved people of food but also stripped them of their history, their future, and their very existence. According to later research conducted by the Vietnam Institute of History, the devastating famine of this period affected 32 provinces from Quang Tri to the northern regions. In 1945, the population of these provinces was approximately 13 million, while the entire country had over 20 million people. The famine claimed around 2 million lives, amounting to 10% of the total population. Professor Van Tao, former director of the Vietnam Institute of History, highlighted the underlying causes beyond natural disasters. The Japanese fascist government imposed heavy taxes and high rents, but, more critically, they implemented an aggressive command economy. As World War II intensified, Japan's demand for coal, oil, and electricity skyrocketed. In response, they diverted essential crops such as corn, peanuts, and even rice to fuel their war efforts, plunging the people of Vietnam into a catastrophic food crisis. Facing national calamity, the Communist Party of Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, spearheaded efforts to combat the famine while simultaneously advancing the revolutionary movement. The strategy was twofold: to drive out the Japanese and the French, and to alleviate starvation by mobilizing mass uprisings to raid Japanese rice warehouses. The March 1945 Central Committee meeting played a pivotal role in shaping this strategy. The party issued the slogan, "Break the rice warehouses to end the famine." This was not merely a response to hunger, it became an essential revolutionary action that transformed public outrage into a political force for national liberation. The rice warehouse raids, often carried out alongside localized uprisings, had profound economic and political consequences. They alleviated famine in several provinces, bolstered the Viet Minh's credibility, and set the stage for broader revolutionary action. These movements ultimately became a dress rehearsal for the August Revolution of 1945, which not only succeeded in overthrowing colonial rule and establishing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam but also brought an end to the famine that had ravaged the country. From the very first days of the newly established Democratic Republic of Vietnam, one of the most urgent tasks facing the government was eradicating hunger. This mission was placed on equal footing with two other critical battles: eliminating illiteracy and resisting foreign invaders. At the first official meeting of the Provisional Government on September 3, 1945, President Ho Chi Minh outlined 6 urgent tasks, among which he emphasized the fight against famine as a top priority. He called for an immediate nationwide effort to increase agricultural production and proposed a rice donation campaign to support the poor. Over 2 million of our compatriots have perished from hunger due to cruel policies. Those who survived are still suffering. We must ensure they can live, Ho Chi Minh declared. He then proposed a solution. I urged the government to launch a large-scale production campaign. I also propose a national rice donation drive every 10 days. Each citizen should voluntarily skip one meal, and the saved rice will be collected to feed the starving. To further encourage public participation, Ho Chi Minh penned an article titled Sharing Rice, Sharing Clothes, published in Q Quoc, National Salvation, newspaper, urging citizens to embrace solidarity. As we lift a bowl of rice to our lips, let us think of those suffering in hunger. I call upon the entire nation, and I will lead by example. Every 10 days, I will skip one meal, 3 times a month, so that the saved rice can be given to the poor. If we all do this, the starving will have something to sustain them until the next harvest. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the country, people mobilized for increased food production. Farmers worked tirelessly to reclaim and reinforce broken dikes, preventing future floods. By early 1946, just 4 months later, Vietnam had fully restored its agricultural output. Under the rallying cry, "Every inch of land is gold," the government and citizens converted every available public space, vacant lots, sidewalks, riverbanks, and even communal courtyards, into farmland. Short-term crops flourished, and by the following harvest, agricultural production had quadrupled compared to the colonial period. This monumental effort not only saved millions from starvation but also demonstrated the power of collective action, laying the foundation for Vietnam's resilience in the years to come. Between November 1945 and May 1946, Vietnam achieved a staggering 614,000 tons of food production, equivalent to 506,000 tons of rice, enough to fully compensate for the losses of the disastrous 1945 harvest. The most compelling proof of success. The people were no longer starving. Rice prices stabilized and even dropped instead of rising. The famine had been defeated. This remarkable turnaround was a testament to the resilience and unity of the Vietnamese people. Through tireless work, collective action, and strategic leadership, they overcame one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. 80 years have passed, yet the haunting memories of the Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 remain deeply etched in the hearts of generations of Vietnamese. It serves as a powerful reminder. Self-reliance and national resilience are the keys to safeguarding sovereignty. Vigilance and preparedness are crucial in the face of external threats. Economic development and global integration must go hand in hand to ensure a prosperous and stable future. For Vietnam, the lesson is clear: only by fostering a strong, independent, and forward-looking nation can the people truly achieve the vision of a wealthy country, a just society, and a democratic, civilized nation.